Hello, and today we're going to have a conversation all about the restoration, the English restoration of the monarchy in the 17th century. I am joined by Rupert August. How are you, Rupert?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, not
Although,
at all. I understand this is one of among your favourite topics.
yes, it's definitely something I've been looking into recently. Though I will say it's not necessarily just the English Restoration, and in fact, that's probably one of the ones that I know less about, the intricacies of at least, because I think the one that took place in France after the fall of Napoleon is possibly has more different sort of moving parts going on, and there's a little bit in there that might give you some sense of let's say where Cthulhu doesn't necessarily always swim left.
Right. Yeah, because that's the Bourbon restoration, isn't it? That one.
Yes,
Um,
exactly.
but
But
we
it's
this is the House of Stuart we're talking about here.
yeah,
Um, so I mean, obviously, it revolves heavily around what is really the story of Charles II, isn't it? Really, so it's a sort of a fascinating figure. I think most people that are interested in English history, you've got sort of the Cromwellian interlude, but you've got the lives of Charles I and Charles II interrupted by sort of the Commonwealth or what they call it, the Protectorate of Oliver Cromwell. I find it absolutely fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I wondered what sort of angle you might like to attack it at, but I thought perhaps we could at least, go through it a bit chronologically. Maybe start with the death of Oliver Cromwell, perhaps something
yes,
there.
we can do
Let's go.
because the interesting thing is that, especially if you're looking at things from a very deterministic perspective, the restoration doesn't really make much sense. It doesn't necessarily
Hmm.
fit into that mold
Hmm.
because what it comes down to is really the right person finding his way into the right place at the right time, and that is George Monck.
Right,
He
General
was
Monk. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry, I
yeah,
interrupted you. Go
sorry.
ahead.
He was a initially a royalist commander, I believe, or a royalist sympathizer who found his way into the parliamentarian ranks in the, I believe it was in the New Model Army itself. Um, but he ended up being quite trusted by Cromwell, not least because he was someone who could be moderated and someone who could sort of keep his duty separate from his personal beliefs.
Hmm.
And so he rose up the ranks quite rapidly uh, until by the time you get to Cromwell's death, he is one of the most trusted and powerful men in the New Model Army, despite being a royalist.
Right. Yeah, because I've always been interested in who was the exact where power lies, and even if it goes to someone's hands who isn't, strictly on the king lists or anything, who actually who sat in the cockpit of power, and you could say that General Monk, for a window of time there, directly after Oliver Cromwell's death, but the historians say he was some sort of de facto, well, king is too much, but the de facto ruler in real terms. There was no more powerful general than him, and if the power itself lay with the army at that point, which it did, didn't it? Really, you could say Monk sort of held all the cards. Do you think that's fair to say, or am I overstating it in your opinion?
No, he essentially, well, to my mind, he essentially inherited something of Cromwell's position, albeit without Cromwell's sort of personal qualities and gravitas that had allowed him to play such a pivotal role in all affairs of state. There's quite a good theory that I've heard about why Cromwell turned down the throne or the crown when it was offered to him, and it's because accepting the crown would entail more limits on his power than he actually faced at the present moment. So yeah,
That is
but
interesting, isn't it? I can sort of believe it as well. There is, of course, the figure of Richard Cromwell, isn't there? Tumbledown Dick, Oliver Cromwell's eldest son, or even more rudely, I've heard him being called Queen Dick. Um, because I
well,
think they tried, well, they did, didn't they? Give him sort of all the power, at least briefly, but it became clear that one, he couldn't wield it. Two, they never really meant him to actually, wield policy like his father had done. So I think technically you can say that Richard Cromwell was sort of ruler very briefly, but as you say, a man like Monk. Well, there was another important general, wasn't there? Lambeth, Lambert. I can't remember. Sorry, there was another general that basically Monk pipped to the post. Um, but yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've got any feelings about sort of Richard Cromwell or that very short window of time there.
um, well, it's essentially one of those situations where the institution was so unstable that the person who was set up to fill a position was just not up to was not up to the task because he just completely lacked all of the personal qualities that were necessary for how everything had been built up to that time.
Mm.
I suspect this has happened in many monarchies, but I can't actually think of too many examples because you don't get that many more recent examples of a monarchy being newly set up and sort of collapsing under its own weight so quickly.
Mm. Mm, yeah. So Monk, I've heard in the histories, usually the thing they say is that it was sort of entirely in his hands. That's probably a simplification, but events were sort of entirely in his hands, and he could decide, if he'd been extremely, or if he'd been more ambitious, he might have tried to set things up for himself. But apparently, as he progressed through the land, it became clear that the public sentiment was just for a free parliament, which everyone knew was a byword for bringing the monarchy back, bringing the displaced Charles II back from exile, and Monk sort of relented to that, or seems he was happy to. He felt like that was the morally correct thing to do. Think I've got all that right as well?
Yes, the dynamic that is sort of often forgotten about, especially the mid to late parliamentarian rule kind of period, is that they very quickly abandoned the sense of doing things strictly according to Parliament, and they had a sort of fairly set agenda. And most particularly during Pride's Purge, where they physically didn't let the MPs who they thought were untrustworthy into the chamber, they were all about sort of very strictly auditing what Parliament was actually allowed to say and what Parliament was allowed to believe. And even then, it didn't exactly say what they wanted, because like I said, they wanted to crown Cromwell several times, but he refused every time. So even then, Parliament wouldn't play ball. So it was an absolutely minuscule minority of people who were kind of dictating everything, completely out of odds with how, well, not even necessarily the general commoners felt about things, because Merry England was still quite strong at that time. But even just the kind of people who you'd find represented in Parliament at that time, not exactly representing constituencies per se in the way that we would expect now, but representing themselves as middling or noble types.
Because of course, Pride's Purge is much earlier, isn't it? That's a much earlier period where we talk about. Well, so because Cromwell, I can't remember the exact timings, but he was only sort of Lord Protector for what, about 6 years, wasn't it? 6 or 7 years, something like that, wasn't it? In that order,
Yeah, I believe so.
which is
Sounds about right.
it's a fair innings. It's a fair amount of time to sort of set the tone, set policy, and sort of change the country sort of fundamentally. But it's not a fantastic amount of time, though, is it? It wasn't like he was able to make Britain just an out and out Puritan nation or anything like that, was it? Because of course, one of the famous things, and I'm speaking very broadly here, is that when Charles returned, he was a bit of a libertine, certainly not Puritan whatsoever. And so you can see where the Cromwellian forces would sort of try to curtail or even ban Christmas, and try to stop betting and drinking and fornication and all that sort of thing. And so Charles, apart from anything else, represents what, a return to normality, would you say? Or how do you feel, just generally speaking, before we get into the details and nitty gritty of things? Do you think it's fair? Because some historians look at it like suddenly there was a fresh new light on England, on merry old England suddenly. How do you feel about that idea?
To a great extent, I think that's probably fair to say. It was certainly a coming back of the monarchy to more popular sentiments as to sort of how people wanted to live their lives in terms of, like I said, going back to Merry England. But there's an additional structural component, which I think is useful to bear in mind, which is that part of like I said, Monk himself was a bit of a moderate. And so he was not in favor of restoring absolute power, as we would colloquially put it, but I might split some hairs on that kind of terminology. Essentially, they wanted to put some checks on what the powers of Charles II would be when he came back. And although some of those were unwound over time, and he was able to obtain more power over the duration of his reign, what they initially tried to do was to basically give him all the bits that were popular and nice and fun, but take away all the inconvenient bits. Because one of the things that Charles I had struggled with is that he had a lot of things that he needed to spend money on, and not enough ways to raise it, basically. So he ended up becoming quite unpopular because he had to balance the books in a way that was very difficult, and that was the very unpleasant part of his reign. So the trade-off was essentially, if Parliament takes away a lot of the raising revenue side of things, all the dirty business of ruling that people don't actually like, paying taxes and all that, and they also to some extent take away the responsibility to fund the army, then all you've got left is pageantry, partying, being a face of the nation, and enjoying all of the official parties and official celebrations, and being merry.
Yes, it's funny, isn't it? It's interesting to note the type of absolute monarchy that Charles I was insisting upon, and what Charles II ended up getting, effectively, right? I mean, it's interesting to note that, well, it depends how you want to argue it, doesn't it, or what your view of history or your view of monarchy is. But I suppose some would argue that Charles II was still very hard done by. He was still, nothing more than Parliament's puppet. And others would argue that he got an extremely good deal. He was lucky to get sort of any power, if you like. Because I mean, correct me if I'm wrong on some of these details, or any of this. Correct me if I'm wrong. But James II. So after we're going to talk, that's a bit after. He's the next king. He's Charles II's younger brother, James. He even sort of permanently prorogued Parliament and things, didn't he? So the king, as restored, Charles II, I think, how do you feel? What's your opinion on this? But I feel like he got quite a lot more power than he might have hoped for. They actually gave him, obviously he wasn't an absolute monarch, nothing like, Louis XIV, nothing like that. But nevertheless, they still just plonked him down in London and gave him loads of authority and power. How do you feel about that? Am I over-egging it?
I think, like I said, one of the crucial components is that he manages to re-solidify a lot of his power over the duration of his reign.
Okay, right.
Not least because one of the things that was one of the things that we're scared about was the Danish outcome, which I think was slightly before this period. I might be getting the timeline slightly mixed up, and I need to check the exact dates. But something that you see in a lot of the treatises of the time, especially from the more Whiggish side, is that they are scared of a situation where the king uses his power over the army to coup the government, and then basically just rewrite the constitution however he feels like. And that exact situation had played out in Denmark to establish Danish absolutism. Right. And so there's multiple things going on. Not only are they, like I said, taking away the expensive and like more awkward, difficult, and a bit of a headache bits of Charles II's reign by taking away the army from him, they're also trying to ensure that he won't be able to coup the government with that same army. Not least because monarchy kind of tends to be in a kind of natural alliance with the armed forces. The two lean themselves towards one another quite neatly. I think that even comes across in the way that for example, even modern presidents are the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, rather than having the top of the command chain being a distributed body, like Congress, for example.
Right. Yeah. No, it's interesting, isn't it, I think, to note sort of what a roller coaster of a life Charles II had. I mean, as a young man, he sees his father go through this life and death struggle over the nature of the crown, the nature of power and kingship. He sees his father executed, and him and the rest of his family have all sorts of adventures in exile for many, many, many years. And he tries to get his throne back. Famously has to hide in a tree at one point. That old story. And then finds himself sort of against the odds, sort of quite quickly, suddenly, really, restored. And then has 25 years as king. And obviously that in and of itself is a massive roller coaster, all sorts of things. And he has to play his hand very, very delicately. But I just wanted to say, if we're starting near the beginning, that it was only about, I think, 8 years or so previously he'd been sort of hiding in a tree for his very life from parliamentary armies. and now suddenly he's at the head of them. They're lined up on the parade grounds in London, and they're at his disposal. And he couldn't have seen that coming even like a few months or a year earlier. That would have seemed like a dream, a crazy dream. And it comes true. It comes true for him. So, he really, I think it is fair to say he has a roller coaster of a life. But don't you think, again, just before we get into loads of detail, any real detail, just broadly speaking, don't you think he plays his hand quite well? Because as I say, they're 25 years of rule he has. And he's never ousted. He doesn't get himself beheaded, does he? He doesn't lose any massive armies in the field. Or I feel like he does fairly well, although there are certainly, of course, some shortcomings.
I believe the earlier Anglo-Dutch wars don't necessarily go too well for him.
Okay.
During
That's
during
right. Actually, no, sorry, you're right. Don't they sail up the Thames at one point? Don't they?
Yeah.
Is there 3 or 4 naval engagements we have with the Dutch, and they really teach us a lesson. Tell me a bit about that. Fill me in.
Well, we do get our own back in the end by allying with the French, and then orchestrating an invasion of the Netherlands in conjunction with the French, and it destroys the institutions of the Netherlands so completely that it ends the Dutch Golden Age, basically.
Because I suppose that's the old perennial thing, isn't there? There's the three-way power struggle between the French, the Spanish, and the English. And so whenever one of those is overly powerful, in the days of Drake or something, or Philip, you could say that Spain is sort of the overly powerful partner. But during the reign of Louis XIV, it's France, really, isn't it? You could probably say was sort of certainly on the land, the most powerful. And Holland, or the Netherlands, was controlled by Spain. Right, the Spanish Netherlands. So we calculate that we would. Everyone keeps changing sides, though, don't they? It's not set in stone. Because at different times we were defending the Dutch, and other times not, as you just mentioned.
This is where you have to get into some of the ideas that were floating around at the time. Okay. And I meant to get back to that earlier because one thing I wanted to add on to a previous point, just quickly before we get back here, is that one of the ways that Charles was able to very subtly improve his position over the duration of his reign was that he was able to patronize schools of thought that favored him. So Filmer in this time becomes very popular, more so than he was, I believe, prior to the Civil War. And then obviously after the Glorious Revolution and that whole period, then you get Filmer being disappeared again, basically. Overnight, he goes from, essentially like the court school of thought, as I understand it, to, the official school of thought, to being, completely forgotten and basically just a forgotten footnote in Locke's most famous work. And then Locke becomes, the big kid on the block. Whereas under Charles II, Locke and the people who supported him had been sent off to Carolina, the new colony of Carolina, to go and try out their ideas there and see if it actually works and has any kind of reasonable success. I don't think it really did, incidentally, because they sort of abandoned that project quite quickly, but as far as I know. But, it's just an interesting way of cementing your power in indirect ways, basically, because, power resides where men believe it to reside and all that. So if you can get people thinking that, thinking in certain ways about where power resides, then that inherently gives you more power. But this comes back around to the Anglo-Dutch Wars, because one of the big ideas that they were very concerned about at the time was the universal monarchy. And they were essentially my understanding is that they were trying to prevent another kind of Charles V situation, where one ruler would be able to basically dictate what happens more or less across the globe. Somebody would try to establish themselves as a ruler over everything. And the contention was, early in the Dutch Wars especially, and especially after the first two that hadn't gone so well, was that the Dutch were becoming poised to establish themselves in that position. It seems quaint in retrospect, and we can kind of say, oh, well, the Sun King was always going to be the main boogeyman that was fulfilling that role. But that's not how they saw it at the time. So they saw allying with France as the lesser evil to topple the one who was actually vying for world dominance. But the reason that this was happening was because the Dutch had such an utterly overwhelming position in terms of finance. So they'd basically been the first to really get a grip of the shipping insurance industry, of all things. And it basically meant that anybody who wanted to do any shipping anywhere was buying Dutch insurance to do it. And also, thanks to the way that they financed their East India Company, I believe, there was a particular nuance around that. Apologies, but I don't remember the details right now. But it meant that, oh, no, I remember what it was now. They were basically given a giant money pot ahead of time and given basically autonomy to go and act as they wanted to, rather than asking for funding as and when they needed it, with a multiple month kind of turnaround from any message being sent from say India to actually getting any kind of results back. So that was something that was hampering the other East India companies that were trying to compete with them at the time, whereas the Dutch were able to completely outmaneuver their enemies at every turn. So you got that on one side, but it also meant that they were able to finance things like a giant, like an absolutely enormous merchant navy, basically. So I think something like 20% of all the world's shipping was controlled by the Dutch, if not slightly more. I might be understating that, but it was an absolutely colossal amount. And obviously they were taking dues the whole time, and all of those ships were being built in Dutch shipyards. So it was bringing, what at the time was pretty unfathomable amounts of money into the Dutch coffers, and it looked like they were poised to take over because they just owned the sea.
Yeah, yeah, because they're a republic, weren't they? Sort of the Dutch Republic. I wonder if I saw once a map that showed all the various colonies throughout the world, and that there was a pattern that you couldn't avoid noticing. Was that quite often the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the Dutch, but mainly the Dutch, would go out and form a colony somewhere, and shortly after, a few generations after, the English would come along and take it off them. So you got places like the Dutch East Indies, for example, or an actual East India Company, sort of the Dutch East India Company or something, and the Spanish or the British, but mostly a lot of the British, would come along and just basically supersede it with a bigger version of whatever they were doing. But in this period, because just to be clear of what we were talking about, we're talking in the sort of 1670s here now, roughly, aren't we? What's going on in the 1670s? You say you thought it was the other way round?
Yes. So the ones who actually first get to a lot of these places and set up their first... But sorry for interrupting as well, by the way.
No, that's fine. Please do.
It was originally the Portuguese mostly.
Right.
And then thanks to the Iberian Union, Portugal loses a lot of their autonomy. And they're basically made easy pickings for... So just to quickly clarify, the Iberian Union is when the Crown of Portugal fell into personal union with the Crown of Spain. So Portugal ceased to have their own king for a period of, I want to say it was about 70 years. And it caused a lot of their early colonial accomplishments to be sort of undermined. So, for example, I believe they took over the island of Ceylon, modern day Sri Lanka, and that was taken off them by the Dutch and held by the Dutch until Britain comes along and takes it much later on.
Right.
But yes, the Dutch took a lot of the early colonies in the East Indies, especially in the Spice Islands, off the Portuguese. And then, because Britain had also been trying to muscle in the same kind of territory, we try and, well, at the time I think it was still England. I'm fuzzy on the exact dates for the Acts of Union, but no, yes, it was still the Kingdom of England. And so we try to muscle our way into the Spice Islands and make our presence felt there so that we can get some of those profits. But it doesn't go very well, and we end up losing those wars as well. And so what we agree to lose in order to cede those territories is the backwards, far less profitable, much less interesting territories over in India. And then we make it work for us over time.
Yeah, but I mean, so by this time, isn't it? It's a great sort of standoff, isn't it, between the English and the Dutch, where they kept sort of raiding us, really, raiding along. Because I think there was 3 separate sort of Anglo-Dutch wars at this time. But people will probably will also know that it's not long after this. Well, it terminates the reign of James II, doesn't it? That William of Orange a Dutchman essentially. I mean, I think their seat is actually in southern France, but basically he was the champion of the Dutch.
Yes.
Comes over and becomes, well, at first a joint regent, joint monarch, and then king in his own right, isn't he? Eventually,
Yeah.
and so, but even there, even just saying that, obviously, I'm encompassing quite a few years there. But even there, you can see that the political situation changes a lot over time. They go from raiding us to being our king, and yeah, just that sort of endless struggle between the Spanish, the French, and the English for hundreds of years there. Really, we're still right in the middle of it.
Well, in fairness, when William of Orange came to rule England, it was as an invader, albeit
Invited over though by Parliament, right?
well, not officially by Parliament. I don't believe it was. It was a group of people who,
Yeah,
in
what
the
did they
end,
call themselves? Sorry, you're quite right. They called themselves. It was just a private conspiracy, wasn't it? Actually, really, even though they were the
yes,
leading men of the day, though, weren't they? It's fair to say that.
yeah, I want to say the glorious. No, doesn't sound right. Was it the Immortal Seven? Or something?
Oh, I'm not sure. I'm
I,
not
I,
sure.
I can't remember anyway. Either way, it was a small group of magnates
Yeah,
essentially.
right.
But by that point, uh, James II had done a pretty poor job of ingratiating himself to most of his supporters, and so basically nobody, not even his traditional support base of the Tories, would fight for him, apart from in Ireland, and that didn't go terribly well for them.
Right. So I suppose if we pick up a bit about once Charles comes back or is invited back, the power goes to the General Monk, who sort of isn't ambitious enough to want to just take the crown for himself or something like that. So he is prepared to sort of call a new parliament, which is what they do. And it seems like it was in everyone's mind, or from the accounts I've read or seen about, is that the majority of people wanted a return of the monarchy. They were thoroughly sick with sort of the Cromwellian version of England, and
Yes.
and I just find it surprising that sort of what do you think of sort of how overwhelming it was. There was sort of, it seems that in everyone's minds, in the accounts, peeps and things, people were really quite happy to see Charles Stuart come back. And it just seems surprising to me that we'd had this relatively bitter, quite bloody civil war gone on for, the whole process had gone on for decades now, basically. And nearly everyone, perhaps I'm oversimplifying it, but it seems like a lot of everyone thought that the king should return, and that there's almost no question in a lot of people's minds that, of course, we're going to go back to a monarchy. Like, that's almost a no-brainer. We'll keep them under tighter scrutiny. Parliament will never be sort of, fully swept aside ever again. But nevertheless, we'll certainly have a king back. Do you find that surprising at all?
No, not from a historical perspective. So this exact dynamic essentially plays itself out slightly with a slightly different outcome in the French Revolution as well, because after the Thermidorian reaction, they again have, which is, I should say, the overthrowing of the Jacobins, initially by other Jacobins, but then more right wing elements are able to sort of move in and make a lot of capital out of it. And on the basis of that, they hold actual, honest elections. But then they find that a majority of people want the king back. But the Thermidorians themselves were Republicans, so they just couped their own government and annulled the election results. But even up until I want to say the 1870s, at least, a very solid majority of France did want the king back. But for a host of reasons, some of them fairly arbitrary. The last big one being that they couldn't agree on which flag to use. They never actually managed to get the king back. So I think it's the Third Republic starts off with a majority of Republicans who a majority of monarchists who are very reluctantly forced to actually govern the country themselves rather than returning the throne to the king. just because again they can't agree on which flag to use, whether it's the old Bourbon flag or whether it's the Republican tricolor.
It's funny, isn't it, that that should be the sticking point?
Yeah, which again goes to this idea that sometimes like massive historical trends just turn on what one person happens to think given the right position.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely the case, because some versions, some readings of history say that the individual people and what they say and do don't really matter very much. It's all a broad sweep. But when you read history, when you look at it in detail, that's not always the case by quite a long chalk. Really, what one individual person thought or insisted can change history, right? I mean, imagine if Monk was minded very, very differently. If he was prepared to throw the chips high and start wars again in order to keep himself at the pinnacle of power. For example, that's just one tiny example. But I think the thing I was trying to get at a bit about sort of saying it's surprising, maybe it's not as surprising, because you're quite right. I agree with your view there, what you just expressed. Perhaps it isn't all that surprising that the majority of people were happy to see the monarchy returned. But what I think is surprising, I think I was reading. I can't remember who it was, but I was reading someone just recently for this, and they were talking about how the army disbanded, or Monk disbanded them, or Parliament asked Monk to disband them, and essentially they just sort of did. They all these great and terrible men, the leaders of the army, sort of all slinked off effectively to their manor houses and were quiet. So it's interesting to see that all the way through the Cromwellian period, or the Civil War, how the leaders of the army and what the army think and what policies the army want and how the army feel about religion is all really, really important, and kind of the crux of the matter a lot of the time. And so in that window of time where Monk is making his decisions, they could have been, it could be possible that the rulers of the army were just going to set up a military junta of some type, or some, who knows. But they don't do anything like that. They sort of, like I say, sort of slink off and allow themselves to be disbanded. Doesn't seem there's much hullabaloo about it. Have you got any thoughts and feelings on that? Is that extraordinary to you, or no?
No, I think it makes perfect sense in the context of what had been happening in the wider scene. Because, like I said, what Cromwell represented was a very tiny minority of people, and like a tiny minority opinion. But that reflects in the army as well. So the army had their own, very much minority opinions. So most famously, the Levellers. But Cromwell made a very concerted effort to crack down on that, and to crack down on any dissident political movements which were organizing independently within the army. And so what Monk inherits, because it's worth bearing in mind that he did essentially coup the government himself. So he is the government. He is the army setting up a junta, as you described it. But he uses that power to restore Parliament and restore the monarchy. And incidentally, then one of his personal unit becomes one of the last remaining professional units that's allowed to remain when everyone else is disbanded. So that's the origin of the Coldstream Guard, because the town in which he stays before marching south is, because I think he was stationed up in Scotland at the time or something like that. Right. He stayed in a town called Coldstream. So they get named the Coldstream Guard thereafter. But by that point, the army had been totally depoliticized. Anybody who was tempted to organize, think for themselves and try to act for themselves in a political manner, or organize within the army as a different or an alternative ideological pole, had already been removed. Right. And so, it was already a tool that had been created to serve the leader. And previously that had been Cromwell, but when it became Monk, then they followed Monk.
Right. Okay, that does make much more sense, because when you look at the army leadership in the early days of Cromwell, or even before Cromwell rose to prominence, these are like firebrand type men, aren't they? People like Levellers and Diggers and people like that. Quite extreme Puritans or Anabaptist types, and these are men that won't. They're not shrinking violets. They'll say what they think. They'll speak their mind, what's in their hearts, regardless of almost anything. Zealous, quite often you could say zealots. But when Monck institutes a parliament, and then Parliament decides we're going to effectively disband nearly all the army, and they just accept it. Well, okay, yeah, it makes perfect sense if those firebrand types had all been purged out of the army long ago. Does make a lot more sense. Yeah. Sorry, go
Sorry,
ahead. Yeah.
there was another thing I was going to say. I'm sorry, it slipped my mind. What were you going to say? Maybe I'll come back to it.
Yeah, I was going to say, so maybe it might be good to sort of have a little bit of discussion here about religion specifically then, where I mentioned a few different sects of Protestantism. But of course, there's the big one, isn't there? There's the Catholic Protestant divide. Well, anyone that I won't go into too much detail because we could talk about just that for a long time. But obviously, the King of England isn't a Catholic. He's the head of the Church of England, right? So he has to be, at least on paper, sort of very, very staunchly Anglican. And it seems that people were, extremely suspicious of Catholicism. And of course, all that comes to a head with James II, which, we won't go into in much detail here, I suppose. But
it is worth touching on, actually, because
sorry, go ahead.
One thing that was sort of floating around in the idea space was the idea that the king could essentially manifest into different persons, so that he would have his more personal person, and then his more royal person, so he could adopt two positions simultaneously, essentially. So he might have one personal belief, and he might have a belief that is more in line with what is demanded of him by his position. And that was some of the thinking that was putting some cold water over the idea that James II would be, a monarch that would try to reimpose Catholicism because he personally believed in Catholicism. There were all sorts of accusations about Charles II, and even, I think, albeit less so, Charles I, about him being a crypto Catholic. But it never seemed to affect any of his policy, or any of either of their policy, really, except for the fact that perhaps they made alliances and marriage pacts with more Catholic leaning powers rather than Protestant leaning powers. But even then, that's not always the case, because obviously, I believe it's Queen Anne, isn't it, that comes with William of Orange. So obviously that marriage was set up with a very much Protestant power, and that comes to bite England a little bit later, or bite the Stuarts in particular a little bit later. But this idea gets eroded, though, over time, I think, because, again, a lot of the ideas that you have floating around at this time are of more of a Filmarian nature. And so they emphasize the idea that the king is not necessarily exhibiting these kinds of distinctions. And so his personage is more unitary. And he is, in a more literal sense, a paternal figure for all of England. And England is his personal domain. It is not something that is separate to him, which is one of the ideas that was trying to be pushed forward by the parliamentary cause. One of the things that they were trying to emphasize was the idea that, for example, the state and the laws had a presence that were completely separate to the king. But they couldn't give a good argument as to why that was the case. If you've ever had a quick look into the actual transcripts, which still exist, of the trial of Charles I, much of the start of it consists of Charles asking them repeatedly, by what authority do you attempt to try me? And they can't give a solid answer, because the only answer that they've got is that we have the weapons and you don't. But that's not a good legal precedent. So they just sort of try to sidestep the question.
Funny, isn't it? It's the old Saddam defence. Or rather, Saddam used the Charles I defence. I simply don't recognise this court.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. You can't try me.
But it helped. Well, it was more of an aid to Charles I in a sense, because they were essentially writing the new judicial precedent and trying to figure out the ideas space in that whole realm as they were going. They didn't have a strong, ideological starting point to actually make that case. They were figuring it out as they went along, and only since then have we kind of come up with this, more so developed this idea of a nation, a state, I mean, yeah, more so a state really, and a like a legal system that is, and a Britain that is completely divorced from the king himself, because they were trying to make the case that Charles had committed treason. But if treason is to act against the king, then how could the king act against himself?
Mm, mm. I think again, it's all wrapped up in religion quite often, isn't it? Because I think towards the end, or certainly during the trial of Charles I, they said one of the main sort of actual crimes we can point to is raising a foreign army, invading the land with a foreign army, which included Irishmen, Catholic Irishmen, amongst others. But
Ignoring the fact that Scotland had done the same.
right, yeah, exactly, yeah. And I wouldn't put it past Parliament if they decided they needed to do that, although I don't know. Anyway, that's pure speculation. Won't go
Well,
down
I mean,
that route.
this comes back around in the Glorious Revolution, actually, because they unilaterally decide that they're going to, change the law on the fly, basically just on the basis of force of arms, which is much more in line with the Filmerian conception of law that they're trying to, they're not necessarily arguing against, but they believe is not true. They're trying to propose that the common law tradition that they're operating in is something that is bottom up and inviolable. And meanwhile, they are using top down power to enforce exceptions to the law where they feel it's appropriate and just completely change it on a whim.
Right.
So it's completely in self contradiction. But
I suppose the old adage "might is right." It's glib and everything, but it rings true, doesn't it? Quite often, people that just have the executive power will just wield it to their own advantage, really, regardless of almost anything else. That's quite often the case, isn't it?
Yep.
In a sense, you can't really blame people. It takes an extraordinary force of character or will to not do that, to actively undermine your own political position when you don't have to.
Well, I mean, it can work out positively because
there are examples.
Part of the argument behind common law being something of a perennial bottom up tradition that is unaffected by top down dictates, or not unaffected, but not so much affected by top down dictates as it is from bottom up precedent and the custom of doing things. Part of the reason that that's given is because it has a longer tradition that extends past the various usurpations and invasions. So in particular, William I doesn't really touch it all that much, but that's his prerogative. So the argument goes that he could have arrived and changed anything that he wanted to, but he got there, found that the law system that existed at the moment was working pretty well, so he left mostly everything as it was and just tweaked around the edges. Like, no, I don't think it's him that introduces a parliament. I think it's Henry II, the first Plantagenet, that brings it over from the continent. But basically just minor little changes around the edge.
It's interesting just to say, because it's to keep harking back to it, but the religion aspect, because it's so integral to it all. I mean, so for example, there's that great 1970 film Cromwell with Richard Harris as Cromwell, isn't there, and Alec Guinness as Charles I. In that, there's one bit in that which I think is really interesting, really telling. I grew up with that film, watched it loads and loads of times. There's one bit in that where, because Charles I's wife was a Catholic, wasn't it? Henrietta Maria.
Yeah.
Full-blown, practicing, proselytising Catholic as Queen of England. And the king needs to be very, very explicitly, staunchly Protestant. There's one bit in that film where they sit down to have a meal and Charles I says to his wife, "Oh, I heard rumours that you let our son," i.e. Charles, later become Charles II, that you let our son sort of sit in on a Catholic mass this morning. And she says, "Oh, yeah, it's not a big deal though, is it?" And him, for his character, sort of chides her and says, "Yeah, no, don't let that happen again though. That's not on, I can't have that." So, but that speaks all sorts of volumes, doesn't it? It speaks volumes because... one, he's just right, I suppose, but also it could sort of happen. Everything's a lot more informal or relaxed, shall we say. There's no sort of legal precedent saying that there would be any sort of inquiry if something like that would happen. It's all very up in the air, because when we get Charles II's wife, she's a Portuguese princess, isn't she, of the House of Braganza, and obviously James II, his younger brother, does reveal himself eventually to be fully a Catholic. And I've heard one, I'll let you speak in a sec. I just heard one more sort of anecdotal bit of evidence that whilst Charles II was still alive, apparently James had come to him and said, either I'm thinking of or I already have sort of secretly fully converted to Catholicism. And apparently Charles II was supposed to have not only not disowned him or anything, but sort of showed complete sympathy with that. And perhaps even, I think it's anecdotal evidence, but perhaps even said, yeah, he was considering something similar. And so just this interplay between Protestantism, or Anglicanism, and Rome, how integral it is to sort of what everyone's thinking and doing. It's easy to sort of, for us in a much less godly world that we live in, that it's just sort of an extra theme that sort of sits on top of everything, and sometimes important, sometimes isn't. But it seems to me it's really at the crux of nearly what everyone's saying and doing at most of the time. Again, am I overdoing that, in your opinion?
I would perhaps be a little bit skeptical of some of the historiography, if only because you need to get a little bit more into the mud of what the actual dynamics are with religion in England at the time, because you have three groups rather than just two. The Protestants are not unified in any meaningful sense. You have the Anglicans on the one hand, who are the Tories are predominantly Anglican, and then you have the Royalists before that. But the accusation against them is that they're always leaning more Catholic. But that was more of like a propagandistic smear, because one thing that both the non-denominational Protestants, who are more on the they almost all fall on the parliamentarian side, but I believe the parliamentarians are still majority Anglican. So if you follow me there, and then later they basically all flock to the Whigs and later the Radicals, and a lot of these guys are the same people who are off in America doing the greatest amount of rabble rousing against Britain and the Tories, as they would as they would term them, because one of their big concerns is individual liberties, because the biggest liberty that they are concerned about, the only one really, is liberty around their religion and how they want to practice their religion, because they are the ones who will be persecuted in practice. The Catholics are already gone; they're basically a non-entity at this point, since Elizabeth. But when you get to this kind of period, the one thing that both sides can agree on, both the parliamentarians later the Whigs and the Royalists later the Tories, is that they don't like Catholics.
Right. Yeah.
So anytime it's coming up that so and so is secretly a Catholic, it's potentially something that is meant to bring both of the major political wings on side to hate this one person.
Yeah. I mean, gosh, because you say there's three. I think the more you dive down into these things. This is nearly always the way in history, isn't it? The more you read about it, the more you know about it, just the more infinitely complex the reality is. Because I mean, there's just lots and lots of different types of Protestant, aren't there? People that would call themselves Lutherans or Calvinists, or, as I mentioned, the Anabaptist, or all sorts of different stripes of different degrees of Puritanism. And then you've just got the straight up Anglicans, strict Anglicans. Then the Scottish, you've got Coventonists, all sorts of different things, right? But as you say, they would nearly all agree that the Pope is someone to rally around as a bad figure. Popishness is bad or evil, or like the stink of Rome.
Yeah,
is
exactly.
That sort of thing. I mean, it's really quite strong to us, isn't it? That everyone agrees that we just don't want a Catholic monarch or Catholic government, certainly.
Well, yeah, I mean that extends up into the like mid 19th century, I believe. Right, yeah. Even as recently as the main one that comes to mind is the Gordon riots in the late 18th century during the process of the American Revolutionary War, where a group of very, very hardline Protestants, although I imagine most of them were Anglicans, I'm not entirely sure though, on basically the sense that there was going to be a relaxation of treatment towards Catholics, they start rioting and burning things down en masse in the capital. And it becomes such a scandal that any Catholic powers, of which there were a few that, well, I mean, even really just non-Protestant powers that England was trying to enlist to help them fight against the rebellious Americans were turned off the idea. I believe the Spanish were sort of thinking about helping out the British and possibly also the Russians, but the Gordon riots really sort of turned them off the idea. And also, incidentally, for historical significance, this is also when you get the building of a proper internal security apparatus in Britain, because they basically get left wanting. They don't really have any proper police or internal or like organized internal security to actually shut down the riots when they happen. So that's the end of the sort of Whiggish optimism towards just letting everybody govern themselves. But it comes in handy when the French Revolution kicks off a few decades later.
It's funny, actually. I've got a quick example popped into my mind about how the British are suspicious of Catholicism. Even to this day, in the House of Lords, you've got Anglican bishops sitting there. There's no Catholic cardinals in the House of Lords, are there? I don't think you're allowed. Well, I'm pretty sure by law you're not allowed to be Prime Minister if you're a Catholic. Did you notice when Tony Blair left office, he converted? It's a weird thing to do, a man of his age, but he converted to Catholicism formally after he left office as Prime Minister. So I don't think you're allowed to. I don't think, even to this day, which is interesting to note. But yeah, the whole standing army thing, that's interesting. Charles II realised that we sort of need a permanent, after these many Dutch incursions, even very cheekily sailing up the Thames and bombarding London a bit, realised we needed some sort of permanent standing defences. It's funny that it's still the 17th century. That's quite late, is what I'm saying. That we're still in a position where we don't really have firm, permanent, completely permanent navy and army.
Well, I suspect he would have always wanted that, because it's a very useful tool in the arsenal of, yeah, but it's very expensive, and there was a lot of opposition to him having it until there was an outright need for him to have it, and obviously that gave him somewhat more of the justification that he needed to be able to build it back up again. But the big thing at that point was the navy, so it caused him to put a lot more focus into building up the navy again to a much more competent standard, able to at least throw some punches at the Dutch more effectively.
I think it was in this age. Sorry to interrupt, just super quickly. I think it was in the reign of Charles II, right, where the Royal Navy went from competent to beginning to becoming sort of world dominant. Is it fair to say that it's during his reign that the numbers, just purely the numbers, if not the quality, sort of start skyrocketing?
Yes, I believe so. But it doesn't get fully confirmed, to my knowledge, until a bit later, because when the Netherlands are repeatedly demolished, essentially, due to their unfortunate circumstance of being tied to France, mostly by overland, I should say. It causes multiple instances where they lose large chunks of their fleet, and are unable to protect themselves with it, because they're relying on an army that is fundamentally not able to punch on that same level.
I wonder what you thought of this idea. I'm speaking broadly again, but the restoration of Charles II is obviously what it says on the tin is a restoration of the monarchy. But I've heard it also argued that it's really a win for Parliament as well, because they went from, let's say under the personal rule of Charles I, they went from nothing, I could argue, effectively, to, by the Restoration, the sort of unquestionably the highest institution in the land. Executive power really does sit in their hands, and that it's not really questioned now after the restoration of Charles II. There'll be all sorts of wranglings for centuries more, but no one's really questioning that Parliament should be the highest body. And so they've have they not sort of cemented their position in lots of respects by restoring Charles II? It's sort of a win-win for the monarchy and Parliament. What do you think about that idea?
It helps the process, but I don't think it's set in stone until the Glorious Revolution in 1688.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Because, like I said, the monarch is still able to accrue more powers over that time. Charles II, and then later much more briefly, James II is able to take more powers back into his personal control.
Mm.
And fundamentally, the army problem has still not been solved up until I believe it is in 1688 when they, or shortly afterwards, when they actually introduce the what is it called, buying commissions. And the purpose of that is forgotten. It's now treated as as something that was purely corrupt and just a thing that had to be done away with in order to improve the quality of the army, to be able to promote on merit. But that's not actually the case. The original purpose of it was to, again, politically defang the army, because they wanted to make sure that people who were in positions of authority within the army were able, well, not were able, they were people who already had a significant enough investment in the domestic side of the country, within the civil life, to not want to join the king for some kind of coup. Because by having a certain amount of money, then you were established to a certain degree in civil life. Therefore, you wouldn't want to disrupt the whole thing. It's a similar idea to in Rome, but in reverse. Because obviously in Rome you get the professionalization of the army away from being like a landed levy sort of army. And so you get the gradual divorcing of the army from civil concerns, and the army is suddenly only concerned with who can pay them the most, which is obviously whoever can get ultimate power. They're trying to work that situation exactly in reverse until it's no longer required. By the time you get to the 19th century.
Right. It is interesting to see that how common it is. I'm talking throughout all of sort of human civilization here. How often it is that the leaders of an army sort of become conscious of their own power and will just subvert or murder the actual ruler or sovereign or king or whoever it is, chancellor, prime minister, whatever, president. The leaders of the army just realise that the ultimate power is actually who controls the officer corps of the army. And I do think it is interesting to note that, at least you're quite right to say James II doesn't count, but after the Glorious Revolution, let's say that Parliament, I mean, even to this day, nominally respect the Queen, or the King now, as their ruler, but they take direction from Parliament. It's Parliament who tells them you're going off to Afghanistan now, isn't it? It's not the Queen.
Well, I mean, in theory, it's like strictly constitutionally, all of the powers that are exercised by the government, other than being the head of the majority in the Commons, are powers that are royal, but are lent to the government of the cabinet. So, in theory, the Charles III may be true to his namesake. It's not impossible.
Yeah. You see, it's an inauspicious name to take, isn't it, Charles? His predecessors, his namesakes, had very rocky times of it, didn't they? Well, that's something I wanted to mention then, if we're sort of going to so slightly have to start drawing it to a close, that although, as I mentioned earlier, Charles II ruled for 25 odd years and never got himself usurped or murdered, or, never sort of failed ignominiously in his job of being king. There were, though, lots of reversals and times when he had to completely submit to Parliament, or when there was plots against him personally, or plots against just the system in general. It wasn't sort of straightforward, was it? Lots of people condemned him for being, as I mentioned earlier as well, a bit libertine, a bit lax, a bit loose. People weren't entirely happy with how he conducted himself. So there is something to say, certainly in sort of the later or middle part of his reign, it wasn't all smooth sailing, was it?
No. Interestingly, in particular, there's a rebellion. Unfortunately, I don't remember the name, but I think it was under either a cousin or I want to say it's more likely a cousin than a brother of Charles II, who is more aligned with the hardline Protestants, and he leads a rebellion in Northern Ireland, I believe it is, among the hardline Protestants there, and that comes to nothing, obviously, but it kind of shows what the movement in support of William could have been if the monarchy had been able to sort of remain as powerful and popular as it had been at the time under Charles in England, and not and if James II hadn't ostracized his main basis of support. So yeah, certainly a lot of the movements that come to dominate later and overthrow the mainline Stuarts are still sort of like simmering away in England during that time.
Mm. And the Catholics, to give them their dues, tenacious. They didn't give up the ghost at all, did they? Didn't just roll over. There was all sorts of, even for many generations after this, there's always, well, not always, but there's often scares or as you mentioned, sort of the Gordon riots, for example, a long time later, isn't it?
That's a bit later on, yeah.
Sort of popish plots and things during the age of Charles II. I think my view of him. What's your view of him in the most general sense? Are you a fan, or you do you despise him? My view is that he must have been quite canny, if nothing else. I mean, he does seem to have been, well, what's the word? Not very disciplined with himself, apart from anything else. But I think it takes a special sort of character to have ridden the waves, should we say, of, that his reign entailed. You know, not everyone could have done that. He sort of, I think he played his hand, his quite poor hand. He played it quite well in hindsight. What do you think?
Is that Charles II?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would probably tend to agree. Yes, I mean, I certainly have a great deal of sympathy for anyone who leaves the realm better than they arrived at it.
Right.
Which I think is definitely something that's the case for him, and I suppose most especially the institution that he personally represents. So in the form of the monarchy, the monarchy that he's given by Monck is even the monarchy that is around when he's just coming of age is obviously nowhere near the monarchy that he is able to then bequeath to James II. Unfortunately, that was squandered, and so his legacy is sort of tarnished in retrospect by that. But ultimately, he represents a very positive development for England before it's sort of I don't know. I guess one of the high points for the monarchy before it is knocked down by 1688, and then by subsequent rulers who tried to take some amount of that power back, but were never quite successful. Because I would say, for example, also George III also strikes me as a monarch that tried to follow the same kind of trajectory, but did so from a much worse starting position. And is obviously never quite successful, because not least because of his bouts of madness, which allowed all sorts of other people like regents and parliament to make decisions on his behalf.
Mm. Did you ever see the film The Madness of King George?
I didn't actually.
It's quite interesting. Yeah, well, I mean, with Charles II, I mean, he was contemporaneous really with the Sun King you mentioned, Louis XIV, right? Who is for a while anyway, and he really is sort of the archetype of sort of an absolutist monarch, and he did well. For himself in that system, but it requires obviously a really specific type of strong character, a strong leader. You couldn't have any old person step into those shoes and it still work perfectly or anything. But Charles II just obviously was never given an opportunity like that, was he? It was never on the cards really that that his word would be law, like say Louis XIV. That was never going to be his lot in life, right? And so he has to really, I think, or do you think it's fair to say that he's really walking a tightrope between trying to restore the monarchy in any fashion that isn't just completely a humiliation, and yet without getting himself ousted or beheaded like his father. That's a tightrope, do you think? Or do you think that after Monck had, another view might be that after Monck had reinstated him and Parliament had sort of, formally greenlit the restoration of the monarchy, that it would have been difficult for him to get himself ousted because people were just sick of all the upheaval that had been the Cromwell years. How secure do you think Charles II's position really was?
I think he definitely did benefit from riding in on a wave of public support and popular relief that Cromwell was gone, and and there would be much less of an emphasis on moralizing against the popular sentiments of the time. So, revoking all of the bans on dancing, music, Christmas, etc.
Hmm.
And actually having a court which is much more comfortable being merry, basically. But I would also like to push back a little bit on the idea that he didn't have more power than Louis XIV, because I think it's possible to overstate how much power Louis XIV actually had,
Okay.
because the historiography gets a little bit dodgy in places due to essentially trying to otherize France and just treat it as an enemy, which is not necessarily entirely appropriate to the actual situation on the ground and the actual constitutional settlements. Not least the fact that Charles II, but even many monarchs before, only had to deal with one parliament, which is actually a very tremendous advantage for exerting their power over the entire country. Whereas Louis XIV had to make all sorts of compromises, and not just to one body. He had to make them to every regional body, of which there was quite a few. One of the big objectives of the late reign of Louis XV was to try and incidentally, one of the first achievements of the early revolution, funnily enough, is to use the model for the Parlement of Paris as a model for the entire country, and to subsume all of France under one parliamentary system, which they had not had prior, and they were relatively envious of England for. So, somewhat to your point, but actually even furthering it slightly, that you made earlier about it being a win-win for both the king and Parliament. Parliament does actually end up being a tremendous tool for the king to be able to exert his will, because he can basically acquire consent, which allows, or at the very least, the appearance of consent that allows people to sort of settle down a lot more. So if they're being given a forum for them to voice their ideas, but having them considered and then duly rejected, then that really helps with pushing through the royal whims. But even throughout this entire Restoration period, and even beyond, the king is able to assemble his own government. Basically, he can ask whoever he wants to form a government, and it doesn't necessarily have to correspond to who has a majority in Parliament. Not that there even are official parties at this time anyway. So he can choose who he wants in Parliament, get them to force through something approaching his will, and he'll get a lot more mileage out of it, because he's not imposing it on anyone. He's doing it with the consent of the governed, quote unquote.
Yeah, that is really interesting, isn't it? Because of course the Parliament will be able to generate revenues much easier than the Crown in the 17th century. It seems like it's really quite difficult for Charles I really to raise ship money and things, whereas a Parliament seems to be able to do it a lot more easy, and with that sort of like that veneer of legitimacy, like you say.
This is
might
more or
be
less
unfair
explicitly
to call it a veneer, but sorry, yeah.
Yeah, this is more or less explicitly why the parliaments, the parliament in England is introduced in the first place. Again, I think by Henry II, he brings it over from the continent as a means of generating additional compliance, basically. And if we were going to take it slightly more in the contemporary direction, we could say that the trend continues through the various suffrages, so that now people are even more compliant than they ever were in the past. Try explaining to the Sun King, the absolutist Sun King who ruled as a despotic tyrant, how much power the government exerts over modern citizens of pick your country, especially the democracies.
Yeah, it's funny actually. Just as a side note, I was thinking that just the other day, that the amount of basically authoritarian surveillance we've got, someone like Mao or Hitler couldn't have dreamed of that level of authority in the immediate sense over people's lives and things. To have a whole city covered by a CCTV at all times. I mean, sort of crazy levels of power given to.
But we get to put a vote in the ballot box. So therefore, we all inflict it on ourselves.
Yeah, we're in the panopticon. We're all each other's jailers. Yeah, lovely. Well, one last thing I have to sort of draw it to a close, unfortunately. I'd like to pick your brain about all sorts of other things for another time, perhaps. But just where we were talking about there, sort of the win-win for the Crown and Parliament. One figure I'm fascinated by, I think a lot of people that know about the Civil War and things is Edward Hyde, the Earl of Clarendon. who is just sort of key to this whole generation or more. Obviously, he's very, very close to Charles I, and is ousted when Charles I is ousted. But he comes back when Charles II comes back as an older man, and is sort of the crown's man in Parliament for a fair bit until he himself is sort of falls out of grace with Charles II and is so slightly disgraced towards the end of his life. But he wrote a couple of histories, mainly just known as the History of the Rebellion, that survives to this day. You can get it in a paperback, go into Waterstones and find the Earl of Clarendon's account of the Civil War and the Restoration and everything.
Granted, that is the abridged version.
Right. Yes, the abridged. Yeah, yeah. I've never seen in Waterstones the unabridged Clarendon. That would be quite something. Yeah, and I love him. I love his writings. I think he's a fascinating figure, and everything. And of course, sort of an arch royalist parliamentarian, without getting too messy about it. And I just wondered if you had any real thoughts on him and his history, or anything like that, because even during the Restoration, right, for the first bit of it, he was really the king's man in the lower house.
Yes, well, it certainly represents his view certainly seems to represent that of a lot of people who sort of found themselves a little bit more torn. So you've got the ultra royalists on one side, although that isn't a term that I think arch royalist was the term that was more contemporaneously used, or something like that. The people who were just, ride or die for the king all the way, and believed in his, completely unchecked Filmarian prerogatives. But then you had people who were a little bit more moderate, who basically wanted to continue the settlement that had been maintained somewhat by James I, or even more ideally by Elizabeth I. And she's particularly popular because she didn't spend very much, so she didn't have to rely on these things like ship money to maintain the maintain the wars and whatever that she was trying to fight, because there weren't all that many of them, basically, and she would try to do everything on the cheap. So when you have Charles I coming along and trying to actually act a little bit more proactively, then he starts running into problems around finance again. But, I'm going to keep coming back to that, I suppose. But then even on the other side, on the parliamentarian side, you have a similar sort of thing where people maybe want a little bit more power for Parliament, or alternatively, they just find Charles to be a little bit more of an untrustworthy character, or just to be a little bit more of an unsavory character. And so despite holding many of the same views as the moderate royalists, they end up on the opposing side. And a lot of these guys do end up actually, and as is charted by the History of the Rebellion, when you're going through all of the individuals and all of the actual very specific play-by-play of how everything pans out, you do get a number of these people eventually defecting over to the royalist side, but they're not very happy there due to personal foibles of Charles I. So many of them end up defecting right back. Mm. But that is sort of what enables that whole post Monck settlement, because so many people in that middle section fundamentally do just want the monarchy back as it was, more or less. Maybe some of them have been softened to the idea of the monarchy by the experience of the unchecked, pretty much unchecked power of Cromwell and all the problems that entailed, because I believe everything that was happening during the Protectorate era was not looked on very favorably by much of Europe. They hadn't quite developed the same level of response to it that they would later have to the French Revolution, but obviously it didn't really play out in quite as bloody a fashion for everyone involved. But you did have, so in particular, just because I've been reading about Anglo-Russian foreign relations in the relatively recent past, you did get, in particular, Russia taking a very hard line on the execution of Charles I, and they basically break off all diplomatic contact and treat Britain as an enemy right up until the Restoration.
Hmm. Hmm. I can understand that, because it's quite a thing, isn't it, for a type of kangaroo court to order the beheading of an anointed king. It is quite a thing. I mean, it's it's on a par with the murder of the Romanovs by the Bolsheviks. You can see why all the crowned heads of state in the rest of Europe were completely aghast to see that Tsar Nicholas and all his family got gunned down in a cellar by some peasants. It sent shockwaves around the world. You know,
Well, at
I do
least
understand that.
the Bolsheviks had some sense about how disgusting it was, so they tried to hide it for a while until it was no longer possible. I
Right.
don't think it came out properly, and they kept denying it until something like 7 years later, and somebody had finally done all the research and tried to figure out exactly what was what when it came to the Romanovs, and he came to the conclusion that they'd been murdered.
Mm, I don't think they actually excavated their bones until like the 1990s or the early 2000s or something. Anyway, a long, long time later, you know.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting thing about the topic of restoration more broadly is where this manifests presently in places like Russia, because there was a very much a reassessment of uh, the imperial era in general, and I think that's the imperial era, especially the ideas that come out of the imperial era, do have a lot to teach us. There's a surprising amount of continuity between the modern if flagging, um, you could say either NRX or dissident right ideas, and that whole movement and the conclusions that it comes to, and what many figures in the late autocratic period, or the late imperial period of Russia were saying.
Mm.
It's very
Just put
curious.
a funny thought in my head. I wonder if Putin was ever toppled, that an actual czarist regime would be restored in the Russias.
It's been
That
proposed.
would be funny to see, wouldn't it? Though.
It's been suggested. Yeah, I mean, one of the funny things that you'll see a lot of times when you're looking at, for example, opposition protests. There was the snow revolution, for example, which failed, which was another attempted color revolution, I would say,
When was this? Sorry, which one's this?
2011 to
Oh, right.
2013.
Okay. Right.
Right before the one in Ukraine. Um, and in that case, seeing all the people who are lined up on the same side against the government is quite curious, because you have a combination of Nazbols, like the synthesis between National Socialism and Bolshevism. Very bizarre, but it exists in Russia apparently, I'm told. Um, the continuity of the Russian Communist Party, Russian nationalists, and Russian imperialists, as well as liberals and all sorts of others, all lining up on the same side to oppose the current government, because everyone's got a problem with the government, whether it be that they're not right enough or too far right.
Yeah, that is very, very interesting. Well, unfortunately, Rupert, I do need to draw it to a close about here, but it'd be great to have you back. Maybe we could talk about um, James II and the Glorious Revolution in more detail another time, because certainly there's a lot to talk about, and you obviously really do know your stuff. So it's always great to pick the mind of somebody who is a fan of this period. So, well, I'll thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. I'd love to come back if you will, if you will have me. And yeah, I mean, there's plenty of other restorations to get into. Like I said at the start, the specific dynamics of the Bourbon Restoration would be a very good one to get into.
All right, yeah, doesn't we're not married to talking about English history alone. So yeah, happy to talk about. I'd love to talk about the Bourbon Restoration. Is it Louis the 18th comes back, right? That's that king, the restored king is a Louis the 18th, right?
Yes, I believe
Yes,
so.
that's right. Yeah.
But Charles the I don't know. For me personally, Charles X is the more interesting
Oh,
character.
right.
But I mean, there's a whole lot of undercurrents and secret societies and all sorts of exciting things like that are playing out in the late Napoleonic period. So that presage the return of the Bourbons. So that's very very good stuff as well.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks for your time, and we'll leave it there. Take care.